It's been a while since we've actually done these in person, or at least virtually, or had them. It's been a lot of holidays and that kind of thing. So we have not had a new video recently because of all the holiday cheer that we've had between Samhain, Laban, Lunasan, all that jazz. We've been crazy busy dealing with all of that. So, but we're back. But not also in the normal location. For those that have watched our videos before, we've been like in libraries and we've been in my living room and that sort of thing. But now we're in a very different location because we, Gwen and I actually moved. Yeah, Gwen's over here to stage right, because I just learned that. We decided to move to Lincoln, Nebraska. So we are working on District 2 here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and this is the new chapel for this area. So we're recording from a new location. So welcome to all those who are new as well. And we'll talk about some ground rules and that sort of thing too. So my name is Andrews. I'm the hierophant of the Church of Witchcraft. Basically, I make sure things don't go too far off the rails. Speaking of things that didn't go off the rails, we actually managed to get our 501c3, which is the federal charity recognition. So we're super jazzed about that and what that can bring to the church and all of its members as well. We're going to keep tooting that horn for the next like 6 months to a year because that took some serious effort. So that's basically what my role is in the organization. I practice celestial witchcraft. All of us practice witchcraft of some iteration. We call the types different modalities. Mine is celestial, and I work more with planets and stars and that sort of thing. So thank you to YouTube or whatever platform you happen to be looking at this on in the future, and we appreciate the time that you spend with us here. Cool. So today's topic is one of those things that we haven't really had an opportunity to speak of, not just within the church, but just in, it's not a conversation that we often have. So our topic today is death and dying. So we're going to look at what it is. We're going to talk about some of our ground rules as well with that, just to make sure everybody stays healthy, because they can be heavy topics, and there's a lot of people that have different histories, and we want to respect those as well. Again, we are one way, not the way, so this is just, think of these as introductions more than anything else. So the form of what death and dying even is, right? We have two different terms here, and this is about talking about whether all the issues that are related to death and dying, the connected philosophies from a cross-cultural perspective. It is also going to be in tandem with societal and medical contemporary postures of 2023 and beyond. In layman's terms, we're going to talk about what people think about it, how our societies react to it, what the medical kind of universe looks like with that, as well as some of the metaphysical and ontological aspects, so spiritual, that sort of stuff. And then our contemporary postures, how we're positioned for those now. So what modern thoughts are kind of about that. And some of our ground rules. Initially, please feel free, you can raise your hand on Zoom as well. And I would always encourage people to have conversations and ask questions and that sort of thing. I don't just need to lecture you for an hour, unless you're just really that engrossed in it, then by all means. But please ask any questions. Those who are watching this in the future, you can put it in the comments below as well, or message us, email us. Any of those things are also available. And so ground rules, part of that is that ask questions, be engaged as much or as little as you want. We're not going to force anybody to interact if they don't want to. Also, this is we need to be respectful in tone of different perspectives. So the way we view death and dying is varied, and we're going to have probably some strong opinions. Depends on the crowd, really. And also this, you can video or mic mute yourself if you encounter something that's strongly emotional or something that is, I guess in common parlance, triggering. And then also a clergy member is available to reach out to discuss and to decompress or to work through and process these kinds of emotions. Really, it's up to you. We can reach out if you would like us to, but you should probably just let us know. That would be the easiest. So if you are experiencing some of those difficulties and you want to talk through those, we can do so later. just shoot us an email, or you can call us, or you can message us on Discord, any number of ways to get a hold of us if you would like to work through that. Not a requirement, just something to keep in mind. I'm going to go ahead and give a second to pause if anybody has any questions for that. Neat. I don't see any questions that have popped up. So some of this being the initial conversations that we're having are, this is why I'm taking notes myself. That's what you see here on the yellow side here, is because I don't know what everybody's thoughts are about death and dying. I've had this class before in my undergrad. I also, the reason that we're having this specifically has to do with Gwen and I went out to, we were invited, so the church was invited to panel for Pueblo Community College. When was that?
A few weeks ago.
That was a few weeks ago, before we moved. It's been a very hectic time. But we were asked to come and panel with other religious aspects as well. So there was supposed to be somebody from Judaism, there was a Buddhist there, and there was an atheist, and there was
Christian.
Yeah, was it Christian? It was Latter-day Saints, I think. I don't remember.
I remember her saying it, but I don't remember the exact
I don't remember
modality it was.
We didn't end up talking to all of them. The atheist and us, we really worked together pretty well, honestly. And the atheist was really fascinated by our entire church and our views on this. And we were able to share some of our viewpoints of witchcraft, which got me thinking about a lot of this stuff and recalled some of it. And so bringing this up is going to not be comprehensive. It's going to start the conversation about this and maybe answer or begin some of your own questions about death and dying. Okay, death and dying in various cultures. Oh, I'm going to get to one thing right before that. So my own personal experiences with death and dying, I've had a few, mostly family members. I've had some sudden unexpected deaths from acquaintances. I've been around some traumatic situations as well where, you know, they were mass shootings, that sort of thing. Really run the gamut in just my history. So from my personal experience, I've also seen some of the medical side of things where people have been kind of stuck in this weird liminal phase, specifically with like type 4 cancer, the stage 4 cancer, and they were still alive, but nobody wanted to talk to them. And that was really strange to kind of be in this place for them. And I have some of that input from my mother and her secondhand experience as well for somebody that was a family friend that passed away sometime last year, I think. But I've had several experiences, as I'm sure a lot of you have had too, about just what death and dying is and what kind of, how people process that. So not just is it from a scholastic perspective, but also it's from a personal perspective as well. So some of our topics that we're going to be covering is death and dying in various cultures, some of the metaphysical, ontological, and or spiritual things that go along with that. Also the medical part of that, and societal and the contemporary society. We aren't going to get, I think, super hamstrung in like past iterations of death and dying and what that looks like. There is, I think on the desktop over there, once you get that, there's a document in the upper left-hand corner. If you could open that, that would be awesome. It's somewhere. You'll find it. It's a multi-monitor setup. Should be the opposite way.
I try to do it this way and the mouse isn't going. Oh wait, there it is. Upper left hand. I see November. Oh, November.
And then, oh, that'll work. Some of these are my notes also from this, because I couldn't write them all down because there's so many that go into this. But the first topic for death and dying in various cultures, we're going to look at 7 of them. Very briefly is the easiest way to phrase that. And again, this is really over there would be great. It's going to have to be very brief because some of it is just too in-depth to cover in an hour's time frame. And I don't want to, you know, waylay any of you. Okay, so the first one, the 7 that I'm going to be talking about have to do with the religion of Wicca. Then also the Asatru or Odinic, mostly Asatru from what I know, and thankfully we have somebody in the room that if I am incorrect in the, just click Zoom, that's fine, leave it there.
It's not.
Yeah, that's fine. The Asatru aspect, and correcting me if I'm wrong or mistaken in those, various Celtic tribes, and along with some of the Irish ideations. Thelema has a pretty stout response, at least in an occultic sort of manner. Then there's Satanism. We're going to talk a little bit about voodoo, Korean, as well as the US. So we're going to kind of touch on these, and it's giving us sort of an idea of what these cultures are doing and various temporal aspects. Steal my keyboard from me because I'll need it. If I wasn't so blind, I'd be able to see this from over at a distance. We're just opening the document at the moment. But starting from open with, where is that one? Starting with Wicca. Wicca tends to be, we're going to talk a little bit about general witchcraft as well, kind of towards the end of this. And the reason is, the great mountain wizard gave me a great piece of advice. Glasses and contacts can help with seeing long distance. Yeah, that'd be great. They're actually in, and it's still impossible to see. Probably a me problem. Is very finicky. So the Wiccan idea behind death and dying seems to be the most prolific that we find across most witchcraft. And I could think of several different reasons as to why that is. But let's suffice to say that Wicca tends to be the one that gets most referenced. The one that you'll hear very often is something called the Summerlands. The Summerlands from Wicca, there are roots to this in Theosophy from Helena Blavatsky. And there's also 4 degrees of initiation, 3 reincarnated, the final into Nirvana. It is kind of principally a reincarnation idea, the Kama Aoki limbo before death, and also through karmic ruling. Kind of talks about some of the theosophic sort of ideation behind where the Summerlands comes from. And the reason those are important is because that Summerland concept in Wicca echoes some of these thoughts in theosophic context. I personally thought it was really interesting that it talked about 4 degrees of initiation. That you have 3 reincarnations, and then you have the final one, and then that is into Nirvana. So there's only 4. I've never encountered a finite reincarnation before, that, you know, in that kind of context. Within Wicca, you also, reincarnation is pretty common throughout that. There does seem to be a hereafter. And the reason that this is also very odd to me is that we talk about the dearly departed, which I will touch on a little bit later on. That dearly departed idea, we interact with the departed at various stages in many of the practices of witchcraft. What that also suggests is that we think that there has to be some other place, there has to be some other existence, or at least it suggests that that exists. And because if you're calling upon a spirit, then they must exist somewhere. Either they're in this realm, or they're in another realm, or something. But by making the claim that you are interacting with ancestors, and I'm not saying that you are or aren't, I'm just saying that with the claim as such, that would also suggest that there has to be some location for that tangential, separated, non-corporeal spirit entity to exist. But we don't really talk about that. And that suggestive kind of thing leads to that idea of reincarnation, or at least some hereafter idea. Personally, I think that this really echoes some of the Christian I don't even say infiltration, but some of the Christian ideology that pops up, or some of the Abrahamic ideation that comes up for, you know, they're going to go somewhere special, that they're going to have some afterwards. And there's a lot of, I guess, blending in those concepts, right? There are people who were previously in Abrahamic religions that then transitioned to witchcraft, and some of those philosophies are just going to come, they're just going to port right over, but not really fit in. I think that it's interesting some of the claims that we make in general, and myself included, if you're talking about ancestors, like I said, they have to be somewhere, some accessible point, and that suggests that there's a life after this, that they can be contacted. And this will bring up a complication in the death and dying process. Lost my notes there. So the asatru, and yeah, tear me apart for this if I totally get this wrong. Let's see if I got my, yep, there it is. In the asatru, there are more than just one realm where the dead are. Hell, meaning hidden, where the dead dwell, sometimes Helheim is referenced. There is a lot of information that we are relying on, or at least that I see asatru relying on, and I see a lot of reports against this. Not an opinion, just what I'm reading. Snorri Sturluson has a lot of incorrect information, a lot of interesting translations that didn't really cross over in a manner that made sense. And some of that was just filled in because so much of it was, so much of the principles and the practice of asatru was oral traditions, right? From family to family, village to village, it changes, right? So if Snorri is talking about one thing, it may not necessarily mean the same thing for each village or each family. And so there's a lot of misinformation from that. It's a great place to start, but do your research. Witchcraft has a lot of research, I found. Hell is also both the name of the goddess of the underworld, who plays host to some of the dead, and it's also the term referring to the realm of the dead. Etymologically, it's believed this roots to simply the word for grave as the place where the dead reside. There's no connotations of good or evil in and of itself. That to me is important. There's in many different things, you'll see the idea of polarity systems, and I reference that because I rely on some of the, I have to remember that. Kabbalah, wow, I could not Kabbalah, it's not in my head. No, it was Kybalion. Oh my word, I could not remember that name for a second. So the Kybalion has this idea of polarity within it, that there's not really one of anything. They're all on a spectrum, right? And I really like this idea in the asatru with the good or evil doesn't really exist. It just is a realm that is there. However, with hell, there are two special subsections for where those who committed evil in life, oath breakers, murderers, etc., they were known to go. Niflhel, where those who committed evil go. Nostrand, possibly also Vermseal, where the most evil are sent. So there's variations within this too. And you'll see this philosophy, take for example, Dante's Inferno. It would principally Abrahamic, but you're seeing multiple realms as well. You know, it's not just one thing. And I think it's our attempt to kind of rationalize some of these concepts. Did I do all right on that, Jamie?
Really well, actually. The one thing I would have added is a relatively insignificant detail. Snorri Sturluson was also Icelandic.
Yes.
So that also has changes because of the way Iceland converted to Christianity. Their population converted more quickly than many of the Norse countries. In several Germanic areas, you see persistence of beliefs even into the 13th and 14th centuries. So there's that adulteration of Christianity of those beliefs is really much more prominent. Like there's a lot of evidence that suggests his rewrite of Ragnarok, and as you mentioned, the afterlife was heavily influenced by Abrahamic religions.
Right. Good. Some of the other details for that as well is that battle-slain individuals who were not evil would go to Odin's Valhalla or Freya's Seskulnir, believed to be found in Volvanga. That's Folkvangr, just so you know. And there's variations in this, but the Valhalla concept is also not one that seems to be it just seems to be within Snorri's realm. We know that the hall Vingolf played host to the dead, but it's unclear from the lore if this is another one of Odin's halls where those who are not battle slain may go, or it may also refer to a hall hosted by the goddesses instead. Those who die at sea are said to go to the goddess Ran. The goddess Gefjon is said to play host to dead maidens. So there's this wide variation, you know, in just asatru in that itself.
Also, for Valhalla, people who have died in battle, that also included women who died during childbirth as well. they would go to Valhalla.
I mean, sure, that's great. Infinite need for those who have been dead in childbirth. Okay, so moving on to the Celtic and Irish, once my computer stops freaking out over here. I have some of the rites and things that are kind of not necessary. So the Irish believed in otherworld. You'll hear otherworld very frequently across many different cultures, and they think of them in different ways. For example, you can also think of the indigenous North Americans, for example. Caves were a place that they would go, which also weirdly is the same kind of idea that they had in the Irish. They would go to, I think, with the cat cave or something along those lines. I'm not going to try the Irish pronunciation. But basically, it was a place to go to the other world. It's imagined as an underground and sometimes as an island at sea. The other world was variously called the land of the living, delightful plains, and land of the young, and was believed to be a country where there was no sickness, old age, or death, obviously, where happiness lasted forever, and 100 years was as one day. And this is, the 12th dead and on. You'll hear, Avalon as another cited place of where you can actually go. Like, you could literally just sail to where the dead go. And I was like, that's an interesting concept. I don't know if I want to do that. Sail to another island and hang out with the dead.
I don't know, it sounds like a dope time.
There's a website, and you're gonna have to look it up, but Irish Pagan School, they will talk more in depth about these things, and they will expand on these concepts. From what I've seen and read and attended in their group, that they have a lot of really solid societal, anthropological, historical fact that is the backbone of a lot of what they're teaching, especially as their practice. So Thelema was really the most robust, I suppose, and that might just be in my own opinion. So Crowley, and I'm not going to go really into the history here, but the fear of death is one of the great weapons of tyrants, as well as their scourge, and it distorts our whole outlook upon the universe. This is a Crowleyism. Fascinating. We could spend a whole class period, hour period, we could spend a whole debate on that whole statement. Just there's the death being one of the great weapons of tyrants, that it rules so much of what we do, and the fear of death and the fear of inevitable demise can be really strong. What mark do you want to leave on the world? Do you want to leave a mark on the world? And this is where we're starting to get into some of our hints towards where we're going for this. And that is really tricky of just what that means for us and how we're ruled by the fear or the existence of death. It doesn't even necessarily have to be the fear of it. They also have very robust practice that's really well outlined. So I have a whole thing written here that has to do with the sequence of their last rites. I will go ahead and read some of this. I'm not going to read the whole ritual, but the temple is arranged for the Gnostic Mass. The guests are admitted and seated. One chair is left empty. A photograph, a favorite possession, or other memento of the deceased may be placed at the foot of the stele. And then a Requiem Gnostic Mass is celebrated. The name of the deceased is spoken by the deacon at the beginning of the deacon's intoning of the collect nine, the end. Unto them from whose eyes the veil of life hath fallen, in particular our brother or sister, and then they name an individual. The officers then re-enter the temple and gather before the veil. The empty chair is placed within the tomb. And so the tomb is a sort of metaphorical concept within this Gnostic Mass, and it's about this rite, it's about their transition into this place. But again, we're seeing a veil. Veil usually suggests a barrier or bridge onto something else, right? And it goes on from there. You can look this up. Thelema has this very well outlined. And I like that they include what priests do, because in a lot of these traditions, there wasn't really anything that was stipulated as clearly as this. And it might be, as I said, my bias, because I have a history of Abrahamic religion. And that Abrahamic religion kind of tells me that I want there to be last rites. We've talked about that in the Church of Witchcraft as well, in reading last rites. We've not had the opportunity to do that at this point. And I think that would be part of the planning that we need to do. And there's just more conversations that have to be had. I'm not going to read all of this, but they talk about the priests and what their role is and how the people will respond, and then readings from Crowley's texts and that kind of thing. And then they go through this whole sequence about that. And really, really in depth and robust. Now we'll switch over to Satanism. Satanism has a whole other approach to this. And I chose some of these specific ones, and it was chosen because they were the closest to witchcraft and they were closest to the occult that would have some leanings. And I'm giving you some ideas of what these practices would look like or may look like in other occult circles. Magistra Peggy Nadramaya, a high priestess of the Church of Satan. This was from an article. I don't remember which one. I can find the source later. She told us that the fleeting nature of life is what informs every member's desire to live life to the fullest. So as general atheists, the Satanists basically say there's one life. And even when you read the Satanic Bible, almost said the Book of Satan, that would be way cooler. But the Satanic Bible also says that there's one life to lead, and then make what you can of this one, and it brings sort of that finality, gives that worth and that value to this life. And like I said, that's just another take from an occult. The article goes on to read, in fact, a 2011 study on Satanist views of death even suggested that Satanists believe that the deceased, assuming they live their lives to the fullest, can live on in the memories of those who left behind. When we die, the end of consciousness is upon us. We cannot experience what happens amongst those who succeeded us. Life cycles endlessly, and we are part of this process. So we enjoy here and now, and do not look for a fictive afterlife, Gilmore wrote. So they're not looking for this afterlife. They're not getting a final great reward. I'm not getting a crazy cool mansion. I'm not going to go chill with Satan and a cloven-hooved guy. Like, I'm not doing that. Like, this is the life, make it what it's worth. And there's a certain sobering fact about that, about how valued your life is. If this is the one life that you have, man, you really got to make it what it's worth, right? I tend to live that way. I mean, that's why I started, part of the reason why I started the church. It's like, if this is it, I got to make it look just clown shoes crazy. I mean, I might as well. There's nothing else. If there isn't anything else after this, I might as well make this as off the wall as I can. So that was my choice. So going forward, so the voodoo, they have also a pretty robust practice about this. There's a lot of concepts about death. I'm not well practiced in this, and I don't have a lot of information about it because there's a lot of oath-bound, secret-keeping kind of things for a variety of reasons. So the voodoo death rituals, some of the ones that I had found, talked about 7 to 9 days, spirit lingers, which can then be stolen. So if somebody dies, basically their spirit is just hanging out for a week, 9 days, something along those lines, and they could be stolen. So they could be put in a jar and used elsewhere, right? And so it's a very dangerous time, very precarious. There's also, following this, there is a 9-night ritual that frees the soul from the body and transitions them to a vessel or jar called a govi. So the govi is basically where you're going to take the spirit, you're going to separate it from the corporeal form, and you're going to stick it in a jar, essentially. And so that's usually done by the mambo, and that's kind of their role within this afterlife concept. When you have the govi and it's done successfully and nobody has surreptitiously stolen the spirit, they take the govi away from the body and they shatter it at a crossroads, and that sends the spirits onto the ancestors. Another interesting part of this that echoes some of what we saw before from the theosophic concept, there are 16 reincarnations and then the spirit's gone. That's it. There's not like a nirvana, there's not a higher thing. It's just you do life 16 times, and that's it, and you're done. And so that tells me also there's a pretty robust, if they're with the idea that there are 16 reincarnations and there's a dangerous time of passing and the spirit and that being stolen, that there has to be a pretty robust experience of death and death practices around that, because man, if you're reincarnating 16 times, that's a lot of reincarnations and coming back, and there's a lot of opportunities to steal a soul. And 7 billion people on the planet-ish, that's a lot of opportunities to steal a whole bunch of souls. I don't know to what purpose, but it exists, and it would suggest that there is a pretty robust death rites and rituals that exist for them. Pretty obvious that that's there. Yeah, Jamie.
There are several purposes the souls can serve, because I grew up next to a voodoo priestess. The souls can be used to fuel powerful magics so that you're not dealing directly with the Loa. It can also be used to force the spirit to speak divinations, to force things from the afterlife, or for them to act, in theory, to act as spies because you hold their souls prisoner.
Right.
There are stories of using that to keep zombies around and lasting longer, but they're just that, stories that have been, from what I can tell, they are stories that have been enlarged by Hollywood and fiction more than anything else.
What was it, the Rainbow Serpent? I think it was the movie that they, was that correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But Mama Marie just called them soul jars, so it wasn't something she did herself, but that's what she called them.
Right, right. If there weren't as many reincarnations, but it wasn't about this kind of all of these reincarnations, I would be very surprised if there was limited death rites and purposes behind them. So Korean is a weird one that you might not expect me to have chosen as we kind of go down this global exploration of shamanic sort of ideas. The Koreans actually have a shaman that is involved in their death rituals. They also are a very loud culture, I have come to realize. Not a slam, just a very loud culture. Just a lot of their practices. So for example, they express their emotions at death via wailing. And we'll see this, and you've heard of wailing many times before. Take, for example, banshee, or I'm not even going to try the Irish pronunciation, but the banshee is a wailing aspect as well. There's many parts of evidence that talk about wailing and expressing that kind of emotion. So it's not just isolated to the Korean. They identify the Songju, which is, it was a trick reading this. They prep so the Songju is the chief mourner of the deceased. They prep the body with rice in the mouth, cotton, and coins on the eyes. Starting to sound a little familiar to some of the Greeks, right? The burial site is selected by a geomancer for good fortune. A noje with memorial, it's a roadside shrine basically, honors the dead and ensures the soul does not return to haunt the family. This is actually quite important in their culture because in rites of marriage, for example, the priest has to make sure that the wife is not haunted because it will affect the fortunes of the husband. And if she's haunted or found to be haunted, that has to be rectified before they can actually marry into the family, which I had no idea. This is part of when I was doing possession research and stuff, I found that and I was like, wow, I didn't realize that haunting would come into marriages, but there it is. The shaman rids the burial site of evil spirits, for example. So you have geomancer who finds the grave site for good fortune. The shaman then is also another role that rids the burial site for those evil spirits. They offer food and wine. The burial mounds and cremation are also very common in their culture, as well as having a death anniversary, Chesa. I'm going to go back to the chief more, the Songju. The Songju usually is by the eldest male heir, as far as I understand it. And the Songju is basically at fault. And so he has to do all of the rites to make it right and rectify the spirit and appease them. And they are the one that's at cause and at fault and also responsible for all of these things to happen. So all of the burial rites, all of the shamanic binding, the geomancer, all of that falls to the Songju because they're the ones at fault. And it was a very curious way to do that. To me, at least, I've never thought of the deceased's progeny having to be at fault for their demise. And so it's part of their culture. I don't really understand it very fully, but there's a lot of familial ties and rules and laws that go into their culture that have to do with like the youth taking care of the elderly, for example. And if they're not doing that well, then they're dying alone and depressed. And then the Songju then has to rectify those things so that they don't become a demonic entity and possess the grave or the person or the family. So it tracks just a very strange, to me, sort of ritual process about these rites. So again, picking up on some of these occult things, some of these practices that we may want to look at, because in witchcraft, we do see a lot of similar kind of things. There are geomancers, people who use crystals, there's people who do shamanic work, there's a whole range of stuff, right? So these echo some of those for us as well, to kind of give us an idea that grounds what witchcraft rites are. in the US, we don't talk a lot about these things, currently at least. And some of that really comes to the, let's see here, if I'm gonna go down there, this comes to where we talk about some of the phases of death in society. So we have some idea of what the rituals are. My thought is that in witchcraft, we've had so much oppression, just for a whole host of reasons. We're not, use your imagination. I'm sure you can think of some valid reason why there's oppression that's gone on. By oppression, I specifically mean more suppression, I suppose. Suppression of information, of practice, of those kinds of things. So the conversations around death and dying for witches just haven't happened because there hasn't been an opportunity yet. It is not until recently that there's been more of an open conversation about this, these kinds of thoughts and philosophies, and enough witches to even practice, to even have the thought, what do we do about death and dying? So my personal take is that there's just that kind of suppressed aspect that is now sort of lifting. The pall lifting, if you will. That is P-A-L-L, not P-A-U-L. I don't know who's lifting a guy named Paul, but the US, like I said, and that's my native culture. The US is a hot mess, basically. There are different temporal aspects to death and dying, and this is where I think it's the Great Mountain Wizard had mentioned something on Discord specifically. That was talking about why people felt kind of uncomfortable about this conversation about death and dying. There are several phases. Wow, we are just getting a whole bunch of people coming into the chat room. For those who aren't here, I'm just going to touch on this again. We are recording. Change your name if you need to, so on and so forth. It will be on YouTube, so just bear that in mind. So the phases of death in society reference the tame death. It is a religiously driven and highly personal death. This is in the past, 13th, 14th century or so. I'm not going to go greatly into depth with this. I'll give you a resource for it. You can look it up on your own. The death of self comes next in society. It's about mastering death. It's very an individualistic death. Also, the ars morianda, or the art of death, the art of dying, right? It becomes known, and like, how are we going to do this, and how do we express this, and how do we control this? And that's where we get some of the giant monuments, and we get some of those large projects that happen to sort of cement and memorialize ourselves to master death. You cannot control me, right? I can overcome that through progeny, through kingdoms, through civic projects, civic works, that kind of thing. Then following that is the remote and distant death. The remote and distant death is basically something that death can't be understood. So the posture of society, and we're talking, yes, I know we use the roughly Euro-Western, I get that. There's a lot of different things, but this is primarily a Euro-Western text. So just so I can address that. So the remote and distant death is something that states that basically death can't be understood. It's not something that is apparent, and it's only clarified through God. So an Abrahamic perspective, that the only thing that can understand death is God themselves, and it's distant from you. It's just something that's going to happen out on the horizon, and there's nothing that can be done about it. Following that is the death of the other. Emotional and sentimental death is a family affair. And this is where we're starting to like some of the Victorian concepts. We're start seeing, end of 17th century into the 19th century, and even into today to some point. The death of the other has this emotional and sentimental death. So there's this think about the classic romantic poets and writers and that sort of thing, and artists. They have this very emotional outpouring about death. They had memento mori, remember that you will die, for example. They'll have lockets of their deceased ones, they'll make them in porcelain busts, they'll have statues of them, that sort of thing. And it's very much a family affair, and only kind of in that niche. It's not something that was like widely talked about. Fascinating amount of thinking about this, that the Gothic subculture that loves the Victorians kind of baffles me now that I'm thinking about this, because since it's a family affair, the Gothic culture tends to be about death and dying, or has aspects of that overarching, and it's not a family affair. Death and dying is definitely a very open thing, but there's also a lot of Goths, for some reason, that also are really into Victorian stuff, but the Victorians were very private about pretty much everything, and specifically also about death in regards to this. The most modern that we have right now, and this is where we get into some of the US culture, is the invisible death. And this is where we start getting into some of why our conversations about death and dying don't really occur. Medicine basically distances us from death, and it becomes kind of invisible to society. We have it's not palliative care, it's the other one. It's the one where basically hospice, there it is, palliative care and hospice. So hospice, specifically, you go to a location, they basically keep you comfortable until, your inevitable passing. And that's all their role is. There's a fascinating problems with narcotics and pharmaceuticals in that whole role. Get ready for some weird reading if you start down that road. I'm just going to preface that right now, but that keeps it away from society. We're not talking about it. This echoes some of the idea of witches as well. Witches are a fringe society, right? They tend to be scapegoats, historically speaking, that they use to explain things away. The magical MacGuffin, basically, that just explains it. Deus ex witch, right? You're welcome, by the way. An attendant just said thank you. Good, I'm still on track. So the invisible death, we've distanced death from ourselves through our medicine. I'm going to get to your question in just a second. So that distancing keeps death away from sort of that stream of consciousness or that awareness within society. And then to the question for Great Mountain Wizard, so invisible death is just society's fear of hard conversation. It's not specifically hard conversation. Think about the fear that comes from death, right? So the fear that I'm not going to have enough, that I'm not going to be able to retire well enough, or it's going to be painful, or I don't know where I'm going to go, and I have all these sort of questions. And that unknown is very stressful and anxiety-inducing for a lot of people. And then that also falls into some of that fear of conversation. It's not really the fear of the hard conversation, it's fear of the aspects around death and dying. What is the care going to look like? Is somebody going to forgive me? Imagine the fear of going into a hospice, knowing that you're going to pass, and who's going to take care of you? Is my family going to come and see me? Those things are scary for a lot of people to experience, and that's hard. And so it's not that it's a hard conversation, it's about these difficult realities that are going to happen. Touching on that stage 4 family friend that we had, she was in this strange split state between alive and dead. We also see this within like retirement communities. Before I go forth on that, Great Mountain Wizard, did I answer your question to kind of clarify? You don't mind that I read this out loud, right? The response to that last question was, those questions aren't about death, though. They are about retiring or your feelings for others, not necessarily about your own afterlife. Right. So the afterlife is one aspect of that anxiety kind of inducing thing. Is there an afterlife? Am I going to reincarnate? That metaphysical unknown also is anxiety inducing, not just what the care is going to look like. And for all of those reasons and more of them, it becomes we distance ourselves from that death. We don't see it. We don't have to face those kinds of questions, those things that cause that anxiety. So a little clearer? Cool. All right.
I feel like that could also go to like the fear of like what you're leaving behind for your family members, whether it be debt or, no debt, but not much money, or just the medical bills that you've accrued during this.
A hoarder's nightmare.
Right. What your own living situation is. So I think it's just kind of like, right, like it's encompassing of that dying time and the fear of what would happen afterward versus for yourself of the afterlife, but also what you leave behind too.
Right. And it's all of those aspects, right? And imagine the weird social strangeness that just goes on. So this person, we'll call Naomi for now, respecting privacy. So Naomi, the stage 4 patient, she ends up in hospice and she doesn't get visited by anybody. Family won't see her, friends won't see her because they're scared, because they're faced with their own death. It's that memento mori concept. Memento mori basically just means remember that you will die, to translate. And so people are going, that would go to see her, realize that A, she's going to die, then B, following that, they're like, wait a minute, I'm going to die. And then now I'm going to be faced with, oh my God, maybe I have to have a colostomy bag. Maybe I won't have this care. Maybe I won't have that kind of autonomy. And that keeps people kind of away from dealing with those things. My mother, however, decided to spend all her time and just ask her questions. She's like, man, how's that feel? How's it feel having a colostomy bag? It's for waste products for the dying that can't manage that anymore. And it's basically your colon on the outside. And that sucks.
It's not always for people who are dying.
True. It is not just for that. It is in this context what I'm referencing, but Gwen makes a good point. And so my mom just asked her questions. What's her experience like? What was the death like? What was dying like for Naomi, right? Fascinating conversation. And one of the few friends that would stay by her side and just be in that weird, not really dead, not really living kind of state. Classic cases that you'll see in legal stuff. I'm going to jump a little bit around here. So the medical, the legal, and the social in contemporary US sort of blends together. Terry Shiva, for example, comatose patient, and by the time they got through all of the stuff, she was basically, she was just a vegetable. Consciousness wasn't there. The Terry that existed prior was no longer present by the time they got done dithering about it in the legal system and whether or not they can pull the plug or not. By pull the plug, I mean specifically because we use a lot of euphemisms. And that reminds me that this invisible death is also this kind of euphemistic sort of idea. We're going to use things like pull the plug, not stop life support. That's a lot scarier to say we're going to stop life support than I'm just going to pull the plug, right? It's a lot easier.
Well, and also it kind of removes the humanity of it, where it's like, oh, you pull the plug and they're immediately dead, versus you're removing life support, and sometimes it takes a while for the body to actually shut down.
Yep. And then what's that experience like? How would we know, right? Especially a comatose patient, if it takes them a while to. My own grandmother, for example, we removed life support 3 days. Unconscious, she was not available. We couldn't talk to her. Maybe she experienced it, maybe she didn't. I have no idea. No, we'll never know. But there's a lot of those kinds of questions. This is why that legal gray area. And so the Terry Shivo case essentially was, can we do that? Is it legally responsible? Is it something that's ethical? And then we get into the whole long concept of whether or not that has to do with religious rights and that sort of thing. And are they right to do that? Do they have a right to life? It starts getting really messy. I can't go into all of it because it's just too much to go into. But suffice to say that the medical, the legal, and the social sort of blend together. Now, we use euphemistic terms to basically, like Gwen was saying, to remove some of that humanity, to soften them. Oh, they went to a better place. Oh, your grandfather went to sleep, or what have you. My family was very plain about this, very pragmatic. And so I do really well with these situations, as well as anybody really could. But when my grandfather passed, they didn't, and just like that, the grandfather passed. When I asked, what does that mean? They were like, your grandfather has died, right? And that past is even more euphemisms, and that's that invisible death. We kind of gloss over this to make it easier to understand and to distance ourselves from that conversation. And so, to the Great Mountain Wizard's earlier Discord point, outside of this, presentation, there were some of those questions. They bring up death and dying, for example, and people get weird and they start getting cold-footed and they start wanting to not talk about stuff because it gets too close to a lot of these questions. Now that we have a lot of those pieces in there, remote and death, other. Spending on visible death, what happens? Okay, so then we get into, I'm going to have to speed up some of this, and we might go a little bit over because there is so much to this. Can I do it? I might be able to. I'm going to have to speed through it. Okay, so where we get into our conversation is it for the Church of Witchcraft, and for witches ourselves, what happens after, if anything? Is there an afterlife? Is there only one life, like we saw in Satanism? Is there reincarnation, like we saw in some other societies? Those are great questions to ask, because just because you're a witch doesn't mean the Wiccan concept of the afterlife or how death happens exists for you. And because of that what are those answers? And I'm leaving you with a lot more of these kinds of questions and where to kind of go exploring for yourself what these things mean for you and how this impacts your own practice. In a medical setting, what about life support? How do witches feel about that? It might be a personal thing, don't know. The honored dead is another one that we see pretty commonly. We'll see that at Dia de los Muertos, we'll see that at Samhain, we'll see that with dumb suppers and that sort of thing where we're honoring the dead. Is that appropriate? Is that ethically sound? Do your ancestors even want that? And we'll take this even a step closer. Do you want that? When you die, which is going to happen to us presumably, do you want that kind of honoring at the rituals that you're hosting? And that's a hard question. I don't actually have a great answer for that myself. My general answer has been let the dead stay dead. I don't really hang out with the ancestors. I don't call on them for a variety of reasons, but primarily if they've already done their time here, they don't need to keep doing more time for me. I can figure it out. Some practices of witchcraft, they do rely on their ancestors very heavily, and that's entirely appropriate. But then that begs the question, that any of our witches, any witches that are with us or elsewhere practicing, or anybody who's watching this, how do you want people to honor your deceased, existence? Do you want your spirit to be summoned back? Do you want to keep participating in this realm? That's a personal question. What about rituals after you die? Are there last rites for you? Do you, when you die, do you want one of the priests of the Church of Witchcraft to come to you and read you, words of comfort? I don't know, hold a ritual? I mean, there's a lot of things, and we can do some of this death and dying planning too, and we're really open to that conversation and exploring that aspect for people as well. And I think that would really be highly individualistic and very subjective to what people want to do. Like if I was in the hospital, I 100% would want some clergy member to come and read me words of comfort, I guess. I don't know. I'm very strange because I don't know what these answers are for myself. And I want these sermons to be some of those kinds of thoughts for yourself. And even more, another complicated question, what about the remains of your body? Do witches get buried? For example, the voodoo and sort of the Haitian culture, I guess we can say, people who are practitioners of voodoo can't always afford to inter a body, and cremation is highly disregarded. So what they'll do is that they'll wait for that 9-day period to pass, and then they'll go and inter the body, and they will rent a mausoleum essentially and just have them hang out there, and then they have mausoleum rent in combination. But they're a very poor society, and so money's not really free. For them, there's not a lot of opportunities for that, and so often they just have fields of bodies. When the rent expires, nobody can afford it anymore. Is the body just a container? How do you want your remains? Do you want water cremation? Do you want to be buried in a forest? Do you want? There's so many ways that this can go, and we don't have really great answers. And this is part of that. Why I say there's that individualistic aspect, subjective nature to what witches are going to want from the clergy here. At some point, we're going to deal with death and dying. I've dealt with it on a couple of different occasions within the church, not necessarily for interring or last rites, but other aspects. And that also begs a lot of these questions. So these last rites, the ceremonies, the funerary customs, what do you want? Do you want something like the Koreans? Do you want a memory, thing like the Thelemites? Do you want something closer to theosophy? Those are why I talked about those earlier, to give us at least some anchors of what other occult sort of groups do, some other relatively pagan things or sects of belief do in their practices for these rituals and ceremonies and customs, and are they appropriate for you? And think about that when you're going into your own planning. And if you're not planning, to write your will and all of these things, we're happy to have these conversations too, and at least just mull them over. I would strongly encourage not getting obsessed about them. Don't go Victorian on this and write a bunch of sad poetry and drink wine out of skulls. Cool aesthetic, but maybe not. Grave robbing's usually frowned upon, I find. Also, I will note that we have this sort of aversion. I brought this up at the panel in 502. We have an aversion, or at least we have this kind of respect of death as well, and specifically places of dying. And this is where we'll go back to some of our general practices within witchcraft. Most people are praying to deities. in witchcraft. Feasts with memoriam seem to be pretty common. We often recall ancestors at Samhain. They may engage in ancestor magic, guidance, blessing, requests. The ancestral spirits may bolster magic with their ancestors. Some prefer to let their dead stay dead. That would be moi. And then there's general fear for disturbing the dead at graveyard. We have this kind of, we go to graveyard, we're like, ooh, don't touch the graves. Oh, we're going to get haunted. And sure, yeah, in some of the entity conversations, absolutely. In the belief of witchcraft, certainly there are concerns with the idea of disturbing entities or spirits and having vengeful spirits attached to you. Certainly a thing. I understand that. But understand what this is and just be aware of what you're doing. Chthonic and dark witchcraft is relatively new to the public eye. The use of human byproducts is not often discussed. What do you do with bones, right? We have one person who may donate their skull to the church, and that's a weird concept, but that's a thing. That is something that can happen. Most witches stray far from anything related to death. We see a lot of sort of that, I don't want to say Wiccan, but really the neo-spiritual concept that staying far away from anything that has to do with death is something that is mostly practiced. And I strongly encourage you not to do that. Be curious, be respectful, do so with as much caution and intent as you can. Often witches rely solely on the Wiccan faith and focus on the Aaronic aspects of this, or the sky or light sort of aspects to this. Reverence does exist for all witches regarding any funerary location, churches, graveyards, cemeteries, you name it, right? This could be from cultural norms or vague relations to other religious concepts. Hauntings, possessions, curses, hexes, baneful magic is a danger of these locations for the deceased in most witchcraft beliefs. And most of witchcraft will reflect the general culture's overarching funerary rites and practices. So generally, witches being sort of a foil for society, that reflective of the catch-all scapegoat, right? They will often rely on their cultural norms of funerary practices, and they'll default to those things, right? I 100% can tell you, I do not want an Abrahamic priest reading my last rites. I do to get out of my hospital room. I don't hate you, not my bag, right? That doesn't fit for me. So I know that there are things I don't want to happen, but my funerary practices and my culture of the US here really rely on some of those. I see that witches tend to default to whatever the standard culture is. And I don't want that to be the case for witches. I want them to have their own unique, robust practices that exist for them. If their culture is appropriate for them, by all means. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying I personally would love to see witches have more of these conversations about why death and dying is awkward, and really pull this from being invisible and letting people die invisibly more forward, and be at least respectful and I guess tasteful and graceful within that. You know, let the dead, in my opinion, stay dead, but the graceful death is a thing, and we don't have a really strong conversation about that, which is why I was very motivated to talk about this, because I don't have a lot of answers for this one. This one just sort of came out of left field, and I don't know. It's a weird one, and I really appreciated this. I'm going to be bringing this more into the practice of the Church of Witchcraft's clergy, as well as some of their training, because we're going to have to deal with last rites. If, you know, from my own preachings, you know, the idea that I want this to be more of a conversation means that we have to lead that charge. That will come in time, but we do want to continue that conversation. I really do want that conversation to occur. And that reminds me also that as we close here, 4 hours, and thank you for staying over a little bit on this, that consider all of these things that we've talked about, the different rites and rituals and funerary practices, whether it's social, if you have an afterlife, all of these different types of occult beliefs in the death and dying aspects. And for yourself, if you want longer conversation, we're happy to have that and discuss more of these things. It is definitely in my wheelhouse. The clergy of the church is definitely an option for people as well. As a close to this, think about those things, but also know that the church is available for anything for discussions. You can do that through Discord, Facebook, come to the SBOTs, any of those things. The SBOTs are great places for any of these conversations. And start having this discussion, because as you go to the SBOTs and SBOTs, you'll see rituals and ceremonies and kind of what that rhythm is like. that can inform some of the death and dying practices that we may want to include in our witchcraft as we go forward. You know, these are highly difficult conversations to have, and the way that we die and the way our society takes, you know, the way our society interacts with that is varied and really kind of touchy and dodgy to talk about. And let's not make it that way. We're witches. We deal with death and dying all the time. So use it to our advantage and be respectful and aware of those things in your own existence. With that said, does anybody have any last thoughts before we end here? I'd be glad to have any input or information from others as well.
One thing that I was thinking of is like with why witches don't really talk a lot about death or the, you know, phases of dying and all that kind of stuff, kind of goes back to that, like, Wiccans, all, you know, always talking about the love and light aspects of witchcraft, and there's not a lot of talk about like kind of the darker, baneful side of magic. I don't know if it's just because of the stigma of witchcraft and how it was only used for evil, quote unquote, you know, for hundreds of years. And so I think that they're trying to, I guess, revamp or re-stylize what witchcraft means. But I think then that also means that we don't talk about death and dying because it's a part of that darker side of life, which I think we should also just be talking more about the darker side of life, of revenge and banefulness, but then also death and dying, because it is a part of life. All of it's a part of life. So I think that's kind of my own take of why a lot of witches don't talk about that within their practices or within their groups, is because we try to stick to that love and light side that Wicca sticks to.
Right. And this also just heralds more of that invisible death. We don't talk about this. It causes more of those invisible dying. The loss of a life is real, and we lose their experience, you know, if we don't engage with them. Great Mountain Wizard, question mark on that. No thoughts that would result in a short close. I'm assuming that means that you have thoughts that would result in a very long close. Oh, they'll eventually chat back, I'm sure. Oh, there we go. And again, you don't mind if I read this, I'm assuming, because it's in the chat. Great Mountain Wizard states, I previously find the whole concept of duality, and I personally find the whole concept of duality an odd concept. So to carry over into witchcraft, it's hard for me to even figure out how to approach, and leaves me wondering if I would just be easier to adopt a known belief. A known belief as in for death, or known belief as in not witchcraft, or how do you mean? For an afterlife. Yeah, it's duality is, I have struggles with that too. I lean more towards polarity than anything else, but I'm not even sure if duality is, I'm not sure I understand that in context. I think there's a lot of duality that exists in practices. Whoa. Okay. That's a much longer one. I got a better answer here. Apologies for bringing an outside resource. Not at all. By all means, please bring all the resources. Wicca, Guide with Solitary Practitioner by Scott Cunningham, one of our classic favorites. He mentioned, like you, that there wasn't a lot historically on the subject of afterlife by witches. Many adopt reincarnation, but there isn't necessarily an official belief because Wicca is so new. And Wicca specifically is its own religion, just as a side note. So it's okay as a witch to not believe in anything or formulate your own hypotheses, or is it more accepted in society to have a belief about the afterlife and live or react based on those beliefs? I guess I hear you saying it's an individual thing for many witches, beliefs of the afterlife. But after there's some things that we have more accepted than others in communal settings around other witches. Yes, I would say so. You know, reincarnation seems to be the most common. Summerland seems to be the most common, but I don't think we should just errantly default to whatever is being shared with us. I think that it's important and prudent for us to consider it for ourselves and whether or not those things matter to the individual. And I think that the greater point of not just it's highly individualistic and subjective, more to the point of be curious about this and what it means for you in your own death and dying, what it means for you in your practice of witchcraft with death and dying. And those two specific things I would start to look at. I guess a third thing would be how society and medical legal stuff sort of shapes what our beliefs are within that. And those three things really I would kind of work towards. So what is death and dying in your own practice? What is death and dying for medical, legal, social reasons, and what system fits best for you, or if there is a system for you. So even defining, I guess, what is death and dying in your own perspective philosophy, which is difficult. The other chat that I just got was I connected the thought of astral realms that have endless places to see, vast like the universe. And then Mountain Wizard responded with understood to what my last statement was. And yeah, astral realms, that's a whole other thing. I would classify that sort of in the belief in other world or through the veil, right? And it would certainly be in that realm to me, but I don't think that there's really, it's not very productive just to classify types of death and dying. I think it's really more of a conversation that we need to have with those three specific questions for ourselves and our practice and what that's going to mean, which is why we were saying earlier that, you know, talking with the clergy through this and talking about your own philosophies, we're here for that, you know, because it's going to help us learn, and it's also going to help you also learn. Okay, I think that we're going to go ahead and bring this to a close. So please come and visit us at our Sabbats, attend these sermons. We will be returning to having an actual schedule of these, probably once a month virtually, so that everybody can attend. Also for inclusivity, as well for those who are not able to access things physically speaking. And we would be glad to have more of you there as well. And I'm so glad that all of you were here for this, and thank you for your input too. You are absolutely welcome, Great Mountain Wizard. It was accolades for this specific thing. And thank you to everybody for hanging in there. And again, if anything kind of touched a nerve with you, if you want to reach out to us, we're here for that conversation. And it is totally, you know, private to have those kinds of conversation. But for now, we will see you all later.